Hello everyone. Welcome to this lesson on managers, leaders, and communication. This is one of the issues in organizational communication lessons that are part of this second week of class. Throughout this, I will ask you to pay attention to questions that I ask you here, and also Canvas will direct you to some self-assessment instruments that you can take online. Because of this, you might want to have a pen and paper ready to write down some answers to questions. These things can be used in the reaction and application papers that you'll be asked to write. This presentation will first talk about the difference between leaders and managers, as discussed in the Cheney chapter that you were asked to read for this lesson. The chapter also includes a long discussion of the various strands of research that influence our understanding of leadership and management. I would encourage you to take a look at that, particularly some of the suggestions for situational leadership and transformational leadership. Here, though, we'll lay the groundwork for understanding these important concepts.
Here's the first question I'd like you to answer. Who was your favorite manager and why? Think back over your experiences with organizations, and it doesn't have to be one that you've recently been with, but any manager that you've had in your career who was good, and what were the qualities that that person exhibited? Who was your least favorite manager and why? I tell you, I can think of quite a few managers who didn't quite live up to some of the expectations or qualifications that we'll be talking about today. I won't tell you about the assistant department chair who once brought a gun to school and had security called on her. This, by the way, was not at LaSalle. And then the third question: in what organizations that you've been in organizations that you've been in, what qualities did the leaders of those organizations exhibit? Now, bear in mind that leaders don't necessarily have to be the people at the top of the food chain. They could be anyone, including some of the managers that you've had. But what were the skills that made that person a leader? Take a few minutes, write down your answers to these questions. To do so, you might want to pause this recording. If you read the Cheney chapter on this subject, you note that there is a big debate in the literature about the differences between management and leadership. So I'd like to examine some of those differences now. I believe that the Cheney chapter has a very good discussion of this, so I'll refer you to that.
While this looks a little intimidating at first glance, you'll note that along the left side of the document, which, by the way, is something that you would not be able to see if this were an in-class presentation. It'd be way up on the wall, very far away. You'll note that there are a variety of qualities in both managers and leaders that have been identified in the research over time. Probably the biggest difference between leadership and management is the sort of focus on long-term value-added direction that a leader provides as opposed to the sort of day-to-day operations that management provides. So I encourage you to take a look at the different criteria along this side of the page to give you a sense of the variety of dimensions that both leaders and managers need to be able to master. Note that in most of these examples, communication becomes one of the things that facilitates this, whether you're a manager or whether you're a leader.
Managers play a very important role in organizations. A few years ago, the Gallup Survey Organization, which also does a lot of management consulting and uses the survey data that they gather to help give advice to managers and leaders of organizations, did a comprehensive survey sort of globally, not just in the United States, of managers and employees and what made employees stay with organizations and be satisfied on their jobs. One of the conclusions that they drew was that employees tend to join companies but leave managers. Think about this for a moment. Think of the famous brands that have attracted your attention, perhaps Nike or Google or Apple. A lot of people want to work for these organizations, and so they join the company because of the reputation it has. However, a large number of people leave these companies after a while. A large percentage of people leave companies because of poor management. People who can't communicate, can't foster a good atmosphere in the organization. And I've talked with a number of my former students who have left disappointed even after they got jobs with organizations like Subaru and BMW, and even a student who worked for Apple in the States. They liked it there for a while, but then they ran into managers that just drove them out of the company. So the importance of good management skills and the role that communication plays in those can be overstated. If you want to keep good people in the organization and have them work better, you need good managers. One of the labels by which management communication goes by in the literature on organizational communication is superior subordinate communication. This is essentially what happens between people at two different levels in the organization. Later on in another lesson, we'll look at communication betwixt and between those people at the same level in the organization and the relationships that can form that way. Managers are most responsible for the day-to-day operations of an organization. This is one of the things that distinguish them from leaders. Communication is essential to the manager's roles and to leadership, but for the moment we'll examine some of the functions that managers play. We're going to introduce you to an old friend, or reintroduce you to an old friend, our pal Henri Fayol. You might remember him when we talked about the structural framework. Fayol also examined the functions of a manager. Remember that at the time he was writing, managers were sort of new creatures. We had never really studied them before, and Fayol was one of the ones to do that. I'll note that, again, even though the writing is somewhat old, the functions of a manager have not substantially changed. The role of communication in that role, though, has. This chart shows you the 5 functions of managers that Fayol identified. Starting at the top is planning, setting short-term plans for what a unit in the organization needs to accomplish. A quarterly goal, for instance, and production schedules and training schedules for a unit in an organization. This involves some goal setting, but again, the vision is somewhat short-term compared to that of a leader who looks for the long-range benefit of the organization. Going to the right, we look at organizing. This is how, after planning where the division should be going, a manager helps to organize what the resources and to a certain extent the people, but also coordinates with other units in the organization to make sure that the goals that have been set in the plan are met. The third function is staffing. This is where you put the people in place to help the organization achieve its goals. Now, many times, people are already there in the organization, and it's a matter of marshaling the best people to help accomplish a job at the right time. The specialized roles that we spoke of in the structural function become important here because you find the people who have the skills in the organization to do the job that's needed. In a big way, though, this also involves sometimes hiring people to the organization to help accomplish the goals that were set by the manager. I mentioned last week that LaSalle is in the process of hiring people both for faculty positions and for the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. The next function is directing. Once people are in place, the plan is laid, the manager gives orders to tell people what to do and when to do it, and works with those people to help identify the way, help get a sense of how the project is going. This relates also to the final function of a manager, and that's controlling what happens in the organization. Getting feedback from employees, assessing their performance, assessing the achievement of the goals set out in the plan. Note that all of these functions, while they have some business aspect to them, are also related to communication. Fayol himself did not spend a lot of time thinking about communication, but over the years since then, others have. One of the more important researchers that we look at in identifying the communication roles that that managers play is Mintzberg.
Mintzberg identified 10 different roles that managers play. In doing so, he also grouped them in 3 major categories. The various roles are listed along the side here. Again, the benefit of doing this lesson online is that you can read this and stop it and pause it as opposed to looking at it up on the screen. Note that the 3 groupings, interpersonal, informational roles, and decisional roles, are all at their heart communication kinds of activities or involve communication activities for managers. The description of what each of the role actually represents, a definition of them is here, but I'll also turn your attention to the various activities that managers perform. With the interpersonal activities, it involves communicating with people within and outside the organization, representing the organization or the division or the team to other people, and to manage some of the day-to-day communication that goes along with that part of the job. The informational activities also involve communicating, using various and sundry tools, going to meetings, performing the very important linking role that you might recall from our discussion of the structural frame last week, where it was argued that having a good structure is one thing, but being able to link the various parts of the structure together is even more important. Mintzberg identified that and also described some of the activities that would be involved with that. And finally, there is the decisional roles, which involve gathering information and making choices about the direction of the unit that the manager is leading. I would like you to take a moment, if you would, and using the lists of roles here and the description and the activities, rank yourself on how well you think you would be able to, or currently do, fulfill these roles. Using a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 is I don't do this very well, and 3 is I do it really well, evaluate yourself on each of these dimensions. So, for instance, as a figurehead, do you think you are a 1 kind of figurehead, a 2 kind of figurehead, or a 3 kind of figurehead? Do this for each of the roles, and at the end of it, add up your score. If there are some areas that you review and you say, wow, this is only a 1 or this is a 2, it might identify some things that you'll want to work on as you continue to develop as an organizational communicator. This is something that you might want to identify when you write your reaction and reflection paper.
Over the years, there have been a number of researchers that I have identified the central role that communication plays. Beginning actually in the late 1940s, and even today, you can pick up books and books and books that talk about communication and management. However, several themes seem to emerge from this research. Some of these are a little overlapping, but each of them identifies important communication characteristics. At the very front is the fact that a good manager is communication-minded. That is, they think about communication. They are intentional about the communication they do, and that communication is often strategic. Managers have a lot of things on their mind, from budgets to schedules to personnel issues. But at the top of mind for a good manager is they're thinking about communication. Good managers are approachable, open, and empathetic. People aren't afraid to go talk to the managers. Managers have an open door policy so that any employee in the unit can talk to them. Managers get out and talk with other people. In the cultural frame, when we talked last week, I mentioned the book In Search of Excellence, which highlighted the characteristics of culture that made organizations good. But one of the things they mentioned also was that good managers tend to manage by walking around. That is, rather than sitting in their offices and waiting for information to come to them and people to sort of bow at the throne of the manager, they get out and talk with folks on a regular basis, daily if possible. Good managers tend to ask and persuade rather than tell and sell. Managers who come from a more bureaucratic perspective, or perhaps from a Theory X perspective, tend to tell people what to do rather than ask their opinion. They tend to tell people where to go. Well, maybe not. I think employees like to tell managers where to go once in a while. But they tend to direct information out from them rather than consult with employees on the direction the unit might take, or to ask their opinion about how a project should be done. Another contrast is the difference between persuading and selling. Now, of course, selling somebody on something does involve some persuasion. But in this case, selling involves sort of the hard sell. Look, this is a great idea. You can benefit from this. If you don't do it, I will dock your pay or punish you somehow. But most of the information, again, are persuasive arguments meant to convince an employee that something should be done. Persuading, on the other hand, involves really understanding where the employee is coming from, identifying what they can benefit, how they can benefit from an idea or a project that you have in mind, and tapping into some of the motivational factors that we talked about under the human resources frame, particularly Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Good managers tend to be sensitive to the needs and feelings of subordinates. There's a large amount of research coming out now on the emotional quotient, on being not only smart with your intelligence quotient, the IQ, but also how sensitive you are to the feelings of others, the EQ. In this sense, managers need to understand how change and new projects and the workload can affect employees emotionally. In change management, for instance, we're always conscious, managers should always be conscious of the fears that some employees have over what change could mean for them, particularly if the change means a negative impact on the quality of the work that they do. Finally, good managers are open to communicating information to subordinates and willing to explain why policies and regulations are being enacted. In almost every organization, something will come down the pike. Most managers are mid-level managers, and the big decisions in the organization are made somewhere higher in the organization on the food chain than they are. When that happens, good managers need to be able to explain those decisions, justify the decisions, and help people understand why things are being done. Often, things are just handed to employees. For instance, we are in the process of putting Windows 10 on most of the computers across campus. Rather than indicating when that was going to happen or why, the announcement was made that Windows 10 will be going on your computers in the next week, with very little training or very little notice. Good managers explain why that's happening and what the benefits will be before something actually does happen. Now that we've explored the communication characteristics of good managers, we'll now turn our attention to leadership. Leadership in a lot of organization involves direction, change, and values. Leaders establish goals and point to where the organization or department or unit is going. Now, yes, managers were involved in planning, but the duration of that planning, as I mentioned before, was rather short-term. Leaders say, this is where we're going, this is where we'll be in the next 5 years. Here are the trends in the environment in our field that suggest that we need to be going in that direction, and here's how we're going to get there. Related to this is the notion of change. Good leaders anticipate changes inside and outside the organization and lead efforts to enact those changes. One of the things that good leaders do is gather information. They stay abreast of what's happening in their field and other changes. One of the things that a lot of educational leaders noticed, at least in the United States, in higher education, is that the birth rate went down about 18 years ago, 18 to 22 years ago. So there were fewer babies being born. Now, while most people didn't pay much attention to that, most leaders in higher education said, look, in 18 to 20 years, we're going to be competing quite ferociously for a lower number of students who might not be as qualified as the students we think we should be getting. That led a lot of universities to begin to work on strategies to recruit students and be competitive, both in terms of the cost of the programs and also what they offered. We're still going through that particular change, and I'll let you know how it turns out in a couple of years. Finally, values. And this is something that separates managers, I think, or leaders from managers most significantly. Leaders are basically the walking embodiment of the culture of an organization, what it stands for, what it holds dearest to the heart of the organization, how the organization makes decisions based on those values. They communicate those values, they communicate the culture, and try to motivate others to follow the culture, to make decisions on the basis of the things that the organization values. At LaSalle, we are often talking about Lasallian values based on the Christian Brothers religious order that founded the college over 150 years ago, and going way back to the St. John Baptist de La Salle himself, and the things that he thought should be important in an educational setting. Now, I will note that sometimes what needs to happen in an organization is, in fact, a cultural change. And a good leader, for instance, we talked about this a little bit last weekend about Amazon's very ferocious work environment. Now, at this point, I don't think Amazon is going to change, but other organizations that have faced problems because of a strong, poor, bad culture have had leaders who had to turn that culture around. Some have been more successful than others. As noted the first night in the report on General Motors, GM and other automakers have been trying to change their culture for years, and in GM's case, it really hasn't taken root. The bottom line here, though, is that good leaders provide direction, help guide an organization through change, and embody the values of that organization, even if those values need to be changed. With that in mind, we can look at a set of leadership skills that mostly involve communication. Beginning in the upper left quadrant is situational knowledge. What this means is being aware of things, of the situation that both the leader himself or herself, as well as the organization or unit, is in. A good leader possesses good self-knowledge. So this is why I asked you to complete the questions at the beginning of this unit, and also to work on some of the self-assessment tools that are available online. The more that you know yourself and where you need to improve and what your values are, the stronger leader you're going to be. Organizational knowledge, how things work around the organization, who reports to whom, who can get something done for you, even if they're not officially on the organizational chart as the person who can get something done for you. All of that and all the operations of the organization is knowledge that a leader should have. And finally, industry knowledge, keeping track of what's going on in the industry, among the competitors, new technology, political changes, economic changes, etc. This ability helps a leader anticipate the need for change and to be able to plan that change so it can be communicated clearly to others in the organization. The second quadrant to the right is goal setting. Again, we're talking about setting shared values and vision, managing the culture of the organization, and with the vision thing, as President George H.W. Bush once called it, identifying what the organization would look like after change, after implementing programs, after going through perhaps a tumultuous time when the organization is adjusting to the environment around it. A good leader has a clear eye for what the organization will be after things happen. Managing change is something that we're going to talk a little bit more in another lesson. Going down from there, communication competence. Personally, I believe that all of these are somewhat related to communication. But here, most importantly, a good leader is trusted by subordinates and others inside and outside the organization. They gain trust by living up to their word, by following through on projects, and by engendering a spirit of involvement in the organization. Understanding is another characteristic here, and this goes back somewhat to what we discussed with managers, in that they understand how things are going to impact employees. They understand the impact of changes on the organization itself. They understand the history and traditions of the organization, and help people see their role in that ongoing story that the organization is telling. And finally, a good leader engenders empowerment. Yes, we expect some of the great leaders that we remember in history, military leaders and so on, are those who were able to give good commands and good directions. But a really good leader also empowers those below him or her to become involved, to have responsibility for decision making, to see that their ideas can contribute to the improvement of an organization. And then finally, good leaders are adept at anxiety management. Sometimes their own anxiety, but also they possess a spirit of optimism, persistence, passion, and accepting responsibility. This is partly where the notion of a charismatic leader, which is talked about a bit in Cheney's chapter, comes into play. If the leader in an organization is not optimistic that things are going to get better and that things are going to work out, if they don't persist at something, if they give up when they're discouraged at something, and most importantly, if they don't have passion for what they're doing, then most of the work that they do will fall short. One of the brothers who followed in St. John Baptist de La Salle's footsteps wrote a treatise based on La Salle's writings that related to the 12 virtues of a teacher. One of those virtues is zeal, Z-E-A-L, which essentially translates to a passion for the work that you do. Good leaders are passionate, zealous people. And then finally, good leaders also accept responsibility. It's said, and it's true, that President Harry Truman in the U.S. had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." Most good leaders accept the responsibility for the tasks that they've been given, for the direction they've taken the organization in. When things go well, they accept that responsibility and share gratitude with the people who help them. But when things go poorly, a good leader accepts that responsibility, does not point fingers, does not blame other people or circumstances, and helps the organization recover from something that might have gone wrong. These characteristics together, as I mentioned a few moments ago, embody a lot of communication skills as well. As we come to the end of our discussion here, I'd like to point out that there are emerging challenges, both in superior-subordinate communication, but I would also suggest leadership as well. Some of these challenges are coming from the environment that organizations operate in, but also from the way that organizations are transforming themselves. I will again ask you to read and review the Cheney chapter because it has a great discussion on transformative leadership. With that in mind, here are the challenges. The first one is losing what a Harvard researcher some years ago called the human moment at work. Technology is everywhere in organizations, and many organizations, virtual organizations in particular, have no set physical boundaries. People come together, projects happen, and then they break apart to work on something else. Within an organization, however, the over-reliance on technology sometimes means that people lose the human element. And in doing so, they lose a certain amount of empathy and understanding that comes with face-to-face communication, or at least face-to-face over something like Skype. If this happens too much, then the organization becomes an impersonal place, both for the manager, but more importantly for the employees. So while good leaders understand technology and good managers utilize it to help the organization work better, there is a caution that over-reliance on this helps reduce the effectiveness of leaders and managers. The second big challenge is the general lack of trust and commitment between managers and subordinates. This is partly due to changing economic conditions, partly due to the number of scandals and leadership failures in organizations, and partly an attitude with millennials in particular that organizations that their lives should be more than just being about the organization. There have been a number of times, and perhaps the most important characteristics of this loss of trust and commitment is the sheer number of layoffs and downsizing that happened over the last 15 years or so, both in the United States and around the world. While a slightly improving global economy has helped this, the fact that many organizations made decisions to sever their relationships with workers almost on a moment's notice made workers suspect of the motives of any leader who says, "We have something better for you." They also became suspicious of management, who would not share information about how a company was doing, and then all of a sudden give out pink slips, firing notices for people to leave. This lack of trust and the long-term commitment, most workers in tech companies in the U.S., for instance, only stay on the job for about 4 years before they move on to something else. My father, on the other hand, who worked for a technology company, stayed there for 36 years. That sort of commitment and lack of trust makes it hard to establish relationships that provide motivation and allow leadership to emerge. How do you manage a short-term workforce that has very little trust or commitment to an organization? Finally, and somewhat related to the second one, is the increasing diversity of the workforce, both in age and ethnicity, the sort of skills they bring to the job, their backgrounds in employment. The global economic downturn led to a number of people who were soured on looking for jobs and searching for jobs unless they met the sort of basic needs that they wanted, fulfillment needs in particular. But even more so, the increased diversity of full-time employees versus part-time employees, people who bring a whole different worldview to the culture of an organization. There's nothing wrong with diversity. In fact, many organizations encourage this because diversity leads to generating new ideas, to tapping into a wealth of talent that might not have been available when organizations were largely sort of unitary cultures. However, diversity can also lead to conflict. Diversity can also lead to challenges of power struggles. Diversity can also lead to people feeling as if they are disenfranchised and that one group might be favored over another. All of this becomes increasingly difficult for a manager and a leader to take care of. These challenges and others will test leadership and managers going forward. But with the qualities that we've identified in this lesson, I think all of you will become good managers and hopefully leaders of the companies that you're in.